It's been a little while since we've had a member of the 10,000 yen club. Those Famicom games where if you want to get a cartridge-only copy, it'll cost you at least 10,000 yen. Well, that changes right now. The next 2 weeks of Famidaily are going to bring the club a lot of new members. 2 of them are solid competitors for the top 5 most expensive Famicom games. And some of the other games we're going to see in this period aren't exactly cheap either. As we close in on the end of the Famicom's life, the games are getting rarer and consequentially a lot more expensive for somebody picking them up 30 years later. And kicking things off, we have Crisis Force, Konami's final 8-bit shoot-'em-up. There's one re-release we'll see later, but that doesn't count. Crisis Force has a weirdly elaborate story. Asuka and Maya were twin siblings in high school, and they started having ominous dreams. The dreams turned out to be prophetic because Atlantis was rising from the ocean to attack the world. But their archaeologist parents weren't actually their parents, and instead they were found abandoned on an island as infants. And it turns out that they're the only people who can pilot the advanced weaponry from the lost continent of Mu, who apparently really hated Atlanteans. The thing that really makes Crisis Force stand out, the thing that makes it one of the real highlights of the Famicom, is the presentation. The back of the box calls it Super Graphics Beyond the Limits of the Famicom, and for the music they use synthesized drum samples. Crisis Force is a game that looks and sounds amazing, like this vertical parallax scrolling effect that you see in a few stages. We occasionally see people do horizontal parallax on the Famicom, but those effects are taking advantage of the way that the screen is drawn, left to right, top to bottom. That makes it possible to interrupt the process and change how things are being drawn. You can't do that vertically. But here's Konami with an effect that really shouldn't be possible on the system. Of course, all of the technical whiz-bang doesn't mean anything if the game isn't any good. And Crisis Force, well, it's not the best playing shooter on the Famicom. It's not even the best playing Konami shooter. But it's still a pretty good shoot-'em-up. There's an auto-fire if you hold down the B button, and while you're holding down the B, if you hit A, you'll launch one of your bombs. But the real gimmick in Crisis Force is that if you're not holding down B and press A, then your ship will transform. There are 3 different forms, one that only fires straight ahead, one that shoots behind you, and one that shoots out to the sides. Crisis Force has 2 different weapons, and they affect those different forms a little bit differently. The power-ups come in orange and blue varieties, and there are 4 levels of shots. Naturally, collecting the color that you're currently using increases the level by 1, except for the first level, where it's always a slow blue-style shot, and collecting red or blue will level you up. The blue weapon is always the minigun, rapid-fire shots. Collecting these power-ups will increase the rate of fire as well as the number of bullets you're shooting. For the rear-firing mode, it stops firing directly behind you and becomes a spread behind you. The really different weapons are the orange power-ups. In forward-firing mode, this becomes a wave gun. I actually found this to be a bit annoying because the wave goes around people. But in the rear-firing form, it becomes an energy shield that circles your ship. It's slow enough that you can't rely on it, but it's very effective if you get in close. And in the side shooting mode, the orange weapon's probably the most effective one to fly around with, because it turns those side beams into homing cannons. They'll line up with an enemy vertically and then shoot straight at them. Maybe not the most effective when you have a lot of targets on the screen, but incredibly powerful for clearing waves of small fries. If you're powered up and you get hit, then you're back to the level 1 pea shooter. And if you get hit again before you could pick up a power-up, then you die. But at least your next life flies in exactly where you left off. Naturally, there's a few other power-ups. The blue S's are speed up, while the red S's are speed down. I found that 3 levels of speed up was right for me, but you can collide with terrain on a few stages, and I found it useful to be faster there. You can of course get additional bombs, and all 3 forms have their own explosion. The most effective of these is probably the one for the forward shooting mode. It's just a big ring that covers a whole lot of the screen and lasts for a very long time. But if you can really focus in on, say, a boss, then the rear-firing mode launches a black hole, which is very small, but does some extreme damage to anything that stays in its area of effect. The side-shooting mode is probably the worst one. It's just a little burst of your ship, and then you reform in the middle of the screen. There's one more type of power-up that you can get. These little icons will appear when you shoot down some formations, and collecting 5 of them will transform your ship into a giant form that's invulnerable and shoots massive bullets. There's a timer in the lower left that tells you how long it will be before you turn back, and you can extend that by collecting more of those icons, while colliding with things will reduce the time you can spend in this form. You lose all of the icons you've accumulated when you die, and they're not exactly common on a lot of stages. The bosses in Crisis Force are really impressive. Right from the start, there's multiple forms, enormous attack patterns, and a pretty good variety. They're not just big things shooting a spray pattern of bullets at you, though they do fire plenty of bullets. Naturally, Crisis Force offers a 2-player simultaneous mode, and for the giant ship transformation, it occurs when both players have collected a total of 5 icons between them. The player who has collected the most gets to steer the ship, while the player who has collected fewer icons gets to choose the direction the big shots fire in. From the title screen in Crisis Force, there are options available. You can increase the number of lives that you get, as well as set the difficulty level. If you play on easy, you don't get to see the ending, and if you play on hard, you get a special extended ending. And of course, the Konami code works in Crisis Force. In this game, it lets you start with 15 lives. Obviously, Crisis Force has a reputation as a masterpiece. It's one of the games that Famicom collectors really actively pursue. Crisis Force is one of the most impressive games on the system, and even though it has a tendency to flicker like crazy as it tries to keep up with the effects, it's still able to throw an absolutely absurd amount of objects at you. If it wasn't for the limited color palette, this wouldn't have looked out of place on the PC Engine. It might not be the tip-top shooter in terms of playability, but it still packs a whole lot in here.